All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating analysis that connects three things you wouldn't normally put together: the psychology of toxic relationships, the economics of extreme wealth, and the massive incoming wave of artificial intelligence. It's a wildly complex web of modern societal structures, but we're going to break down exactly how these pieces fit together according to our source material.
So, let's start with a question that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Why does modern society feel like a toxic relationship? Our sources argue that the modern economy has essentially become a machine designed to squeeze value out of everyday people. From the insane housing crisis to relentless algorithmic manipulation, the argument here is that demanding accountability is increasingly treated as an act of aggression. The rules, according to the text, are systematically rigged to benefit the ultra-wealthy at the expense of everyone else.
To make sense of all this, here is our roadmap for today. First up, welcome to DARVO Nation. Then, the Great Distraction Machine. Third, the Billionaire Tax Shield. Fourth, the rise of digital feudalism. And finally, rebuilding societal integrity.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Welcome to DARVO Nation. We have to start with a psychological term, coined back in the 1990s by researcher Jennifer Freyd. It was originally used to describe how interpersonal abusers act when confronted, but the sources argue it's evolved and has now been institutionalized by our political and corporate systems. The acronym is DARVO. That stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. The analysis suggests we're living in a state of mass psychological inversion. In this world, the whistleblower asking for transparency is treated as the enemy. The worker asking for basic dignity is labeled lazy or entitled. And massive, powerful entities suddenly claim they are the persecuted victims whenever they face even a tiny bit of public scrutiny.
And the sources lay out exactly how this step-by-step framework is used to shift blame and basically gaslight the public. Step 1, institutions deny that systemic corruption or inequality even exists. Step 2, they go on the offensive, attacking their critics and smearing them as radicals who just want to destroy the system. And Step 3, the big flip. They reverse the roles of victim and offender. Suddenly, giant corporate monopolies are portraying themselves as victims of unfair journalism or heavy-handed regulation. Over time, doing this on repeat makes everyday citizens actually doubt their own eyes and question objective reality itself.
Moving on to Section 2, the Great Distraction Machine.
Now, if the economic game is as heavily rigged as this analysis claims, you have to ask, why isn't public anger staying focused upward on the concentration of power? Well, the text points to highly profitable tribal conflicts. We are completely surrounded by endless symbolic battles. Left versus right, urban versus rural, nationalism versus globalism. Modern media ecosystems absolutely thrive on these specific fights because algorithms heavily reward outrage. Fear spikes engagement and division keeps you watching. The result is that exhausted citizens, who are already stressed out about inflation, debt, and crazy housing costs, are subtly pushed to fight each other in endless cultural proxy wars.
The logic here is pretty brutal. A unified working class asking structural economic questions, that is dangerous to the status quo. But a divided population fighting cultural proxy wars, that is highly manageable. This fragmentation isn't framed as just some accident of the internet age. The sources describe it as an extraordinarily useful tool for concentrated power. By keeping us all distracted with intense, symbolic battles, the structural extraction of wealth can just keep humming along, largely unnoticed and unchecked. It is literally a system of mass distraction, masking mass extraction.
Which brings us right into Section 3, the Billionaire Tax Shield.
Let's look at a concrete example. $238 million. That was the jaw-dropping purchase price of the Ken Griffin Central Park South penthouse in New York City. The sources used this specific, high-profile property to show exactly how the modern tax system works in practice. This single real estate deal acts as a lightning rod in the current debate, perfectly illustrating how wealth is stored and shielded in major metropolitan areas.
This is where you see the stark contrast in how different groups are taxed. Everyday homeowners typically pay full local property tax rates, usually hovering around 1 to 3% of their home's actual value. But the rules are completely different for the ultra-wealthy. Because of some complex structural loopholes, luxury condos are often assessed on a hypothetical rental income rather than what they'd actually sell for on the open market. And since there's no real comparable rental market for a $200 million mega penthouse, its assessed value artificially plummets. So that $200 million asset can get taxed at an effective rate of less than 0.3%. The sources point out the DARVO tactics at play here too. The people using these massive tax shields often claim they're overly burdened job creators facing unfair persecution, all while functionally paying a fraction of the rate everyday citizens pay.
To fix this massive disparity,
New York officials proposed a yearly surtax specifically on second homes valued at over $5 million. Estimates show this one measure could raise $500 million annually. And the crucial takeaway here is that this $500 million would be raised without levying any additional taxes on everyday New Yorkers. The analysis points out this is substantial funding that could directly revitalize public transit, properly fund schools, and support local homeless shelters.
Officials like Governor Hochul and Mayor Mamdani are pushing three distinct structural fixes to counter the current system. First is the pied-à-terre surtax targeting luxury second homes to fund those essential city services. Second is assessment reform, making sure ultra-wealthy luxury condos are finally assessed and taxed based on their true market value, which closes that hypothetical rental loophole. And third is the broad closure of loopholes that let corporations and billionaires artificially shift profits. Our sources present this legislative push as a critical test. Can local governments actually force the ultra-wealthy to contribute to the civic infrastructure they benefit from, even against intense and heavily funded lobbying efforts?
Let's zoom back out for Section 4, the rise of digital feudalism.
Looking beyond real estate, our sources warn that these underlying systems of wealth extraction and mass manipulation are about to get vastly supercharged. We are right in the middle of a trillion-dollar AI build-out. Governments and massive corporations are rapidly building sprawling hyperscale data centers, rolling out automated logistics, deploying ubiquitous surveillance systems, and generating synthetic media ecosystems optimized by machine learning. The authors argue that this tech isn't inherently moral or objective. If the corporate structures controlling it prioritize extraction, monopolization, and shareholder returns above all else, then artificial intelligence will simply accelerate and amplify those exact tendencies at warp speed.
The danger is not necessarily killer robots. The danger is automated inequality. This warning from the text really forces us to shift how we view the impending AI wave. The fear here isn't based on Hollywood science fiction tropes. It's a very real-world scenario where human labor completely loses its bargaining power. It's a landscape where truth and consensus are algorithmically manipulated on a massive scale, wealth hyper-concentrates into the hands of whoever owns the compute power, and everyday citizens are increasingly treated as economically disposable metrics.
The sources draw a pretty wild historical parallel here, suggesting we are rapidly drifting toward a new aristocracy. Think about medieval feudalism. Land was the ultimate source of power, and peasants paid tribute to the lords who owned it. Today, under digital feudalism, data, digital infrastructure, proprietary algorithms, and cloud computing are absolute power. This new aristocracy doesn't wear crowns. They wear hoodies, tailored suits, and conference badges. A tiny handful of digital monopolies increasingly mediate global commerce, dictate the flow of information, and control labor markets, largely bypassing traditional democratic oversight altogether.
This brings us to our final section, Section 5, Rebuilding Societal Integrity. Underneath all the economic crises, the sources identify a deeper, spiritual crisis. We're in a reality where society is losing its shared moral compass, and empathy is increasingly viewed as inefficiency. But the analysis does offer an antidote to this mass DARVO manipulation. It takes reality-based moral courage. First, we literally have to name the manipulation clearly when we see it from our leaders or the media. We have to refuse that psychological inversion that constantly blames the most vulnerable for systemic failures. Crucially, the text argues we need to aggressively rebuild our local communities, demand strict transparency in things like property tax assessments, and strengthen our civic and labor institutions. And maybe hardest of all, we have to actively resist the urge to get consumed by the tribal hatred fueled by the algorithmic distraction machine.
The core thesis of the entire analysis ultimately boils down to this. The greatest danger of the 21st century is natural human greed amplified by artificial intelligence. A healthy, functioning civilization absolutely cannot run purely on manufactured outrage, opaque algorithms, and endless financial extraction. It fundamentally requires basic trust, reciprocity, and a sense of shared sacrifice. Without those foundational human elements securely in place, the sources warn that technological advancement won't save us. It will merely accelerate social fragmentation and collapse.
So, will we rediscover integrity before the social fabric tears beyond repair? I'll leave you with this final thought from the analysis to chew on as you navigate the realities of our modern systems. When accountability is treated as a hostile attack, and wealth is shielded by obscure tax loopholes and relentless algorithmic distraction, reality eventually catches up. The choices we make today about transparency, community, and technology are going to define exactly what comes next. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions.